I definitely love fashion. My mother is very glamorous. And I definitely did not dress like everybody else. I didn't. I didn't really want to, and I didn't feel the need to.
Mhm.
I just wanted to be different, and I was always overdressed. No matter what, for as long as I can remember. And I really remember it in my like junior high and high school years. I remember just being more dressed up and always being in heels when everyone was in sneakers. And, I remember traveling on the West Coast with a group of teens called a teen tour.
Yeah.
And I remember like climbing the Grand Tetons and I was wearing heels and everybody was like, you can't do that. You're going to kill yourself. I'm like, I got this. I'm good. And it just didn't feel right to me to not wear them, So that's the thing I always kind of explain is it's not for anybody. This is who I am. And when I'm literally sitting at home and seeing nobody for the last 10 months, I'll throw on like a, fur vest and a cashmere dress and makeup just because it's like makes you feel human, But anyway, so long story short, went to George Washington University.
Mm-hmm. What'd you study?
Sociology and psychology.
Nice.
One would argue I use it every day of my life.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I do in work, in life, with my kids. It's really, really come in handy, I have to say.
Understanding how people tick or what makes people tick is huge.
That's exactly. And that was my real obsession and passion. And I really thought that's what I would do with my life, to be honest, because I was so fascinated by people and their minds and how they think and what makes them go. And so when I left for college, my parents moved to the city. They're New Yorkers. Uh-huh. So I think once my sister and I left, they moved. And I'm pretty sure I never went back to New Jersey after that. And then lived in the city after. Okay. So trying to figure out how.
I'm curious. Yeah. How did you choose that degree? Like what drew you to it originally? Was it because you wanted to know why people tick?
Yeah, I loved psychology. I mean, I got straight A's in my major. I was so fascinated by it. Like it just is so, when you learn, like it's weird. I actually recommend to everybody that they take psychology.
Yep.
Like it deeper than is required, because I think it really does. It just, maybe it's because I have a fascination with people and their minds. I think what I knew was that I didn't want to have a job that was a straight corporate 9 to 5. Yeah. I knew that was not for me. I knew that I had to be moving, changing my environment, being with different people. That was something that really mattered to me. And I hate to say it like this because it makes me sound like I'm 80, but like in those days, it wasn't like it is now, where you have 10 internships before you even start working, or what you want to do at the age of 13. It really wasn't like that for me. I think, listen, I think if you wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer or, something like that, then yes, you knew like what you were doing, how far you were going in school and things like that. But for me, very admittedly, I didn't love being a student. Mm-hmm. So the reason I didn't ultimately become a psychiatrist or psychologist was because it really required more school after college. Yep. And I say that very honestly because, I always say like, I'm pretty sure that if someone offered me in my senior year of high school and said, hey, you can go off and start your career now, or you can go to college for 4 years, I would have 100% gone to work. Yeah. I wanted to work from a very young age. I was very ready to go and do and be and make my own money. And
did you when you were young, did you have like either little hustles or jobs? Or?
Yeah, I got a job at the Short Hills Mall, very fancy mall, working at 9 West Shoes. And I would always win like best salesperson because I loved it. I loved making my own money. I loved not having to ask for money, and that was really appealing to me, honestly, like an independence. And, it was weird. Like I went to school, and I always say that for me, college served as growing up. I really became independent and knew how to take care of myself. Yep. And so I really think college, if for nothing else, if people don't take away like, oh, I'm going to apply this knowledge, which you do. But if you don't, you grow up.
I would say, I went to school for business management. I learned a little bit, but it's exactly what I say about college is at 18, 17 is when I went to college. I was not ready for anything. By 21, when I graduated, like I was ready for the real world. Like it gave me time to grow up and have fun and spread my wings a little bit.
Totally. And that's the thing. And in hindsight, it's like, but I would say that if I knew what I knew, like if I knew then what I know now, I probably would have gone to fashion school. You know, I would have gone to, you know, St. Martin's or FIT or Parsons and, you know, but I didn't, honestly, I had no idea. And I was not an over planner that way. I really wasn't. I just kind of like, you know, for me, it's always been wanting to be great at whatever I was doing in that moment. I definitely had that as my drive. What that was going to be, you know, I didn't know.
And were your parents super supportive of it? Is that kind of where the confidence came from of like, it's okay?
Yeah, my parents, you know, they're amazing when I think about it. Like as a parent, and I say this to them all the time, like on how you did it. Like I didn't get into trouble, you know, I never got into like drugs or anything like that. And, you know, I think the fear, they somehow managed to parent my sister and I in a way that they instilled enough fear that we respected them and didn't want to disappoint them.
Yep.
And that, you know, Roger and I, my husband, we always talk about, we had this like healthy fear of disappointing our parents, you know, that immediately made you respect them. Because for me, the thought of my parents being sort of disappointed or angry or letting them down or whatever, that look in their face was just the worst, you know, it was the worst. And so I think, you know, as a parent, that's kind of the goal. You want to teach your children these morals and give them this code to live by. And, you know, I always say I parent really hard. I do really hard because I think kids need someone to keep them like this. And if they start to go like this, you got to redirect. If they go like this, you got to redirect. And if you take your eye off the ball, that's where trouble begins.
Born in Brooklyn, and shortly after that, my family and I would move to Queens, New York, and I went to actually Catholic school. My mom and dad scraped up enough money to send me to Catholic school, and happy little childhood, you know, kind of playing baseball on the block, doing all that good stuff. And parents ended up getting divorced when I was around 10 years old, but they were hardworking people. And I always, at that time, I really wanted to just start making money because I didn't want to make it that hard on my mother because hip hop was starting to really come around. I started falling in love with the music and I wanted to either buy an album, buy some sneakers that I thought, you know, were part of hip hop. And I just didn't, I felt bad seeing my mother work so hard, all these jobs to want to try to buy me this stuff and that she couldn't really afford. And I think that's where it really came from, my initial desire to make money and simultaneously make money and be part of a culture was probably the first time. So that was the little Daymond John. And then I would have like different forms of hustle, whether it's raking leaves in the fall or shoveling snow in the winter or finding bike parts that people threw out or dumpster diving. And by the time 6 months came around, I would have a bike to ride and then sell, stuff like that.
Nice. And so, so you were doing all these different hustles. And at what point did you do like sort of your first, let's say, business, like your first kind of thing that you stuck with that was repetitive? It sounds like you stuck with the bicycle building a little bit, but when did you first have that like exposure to selling something, growing something? Was it FUBU from the start or was there something before that?
No. I actually had a livery service. It was like a van. It was like a carpooling. And in our neighborhoods, you would go to every bus stop and pick up people just like a bus, but you were just a small version of a bus, and they would pay you $1 to get off and get on, and you would drive them because we lived in what they called a two-fare zone, Queens. That's why the houses were a little cheaper because it was two fares. It was you had to take a bus to the train and the train to get to the city. So everybody would get off of the train and they would need to take a bus into the, you know, obviously deeper into the boroughs, but we would be there, the vans, we'd get there, we'd probably be there 100 feet or 200 feet early prior to the bus stop, or so the women or people didn't have to walk that far. And when I drove you down the block, not only would I take you off the main, you know, drop you off from the main block, but in the event it was 12 or 1 o'clock at night, I would take you 2 blocks into where your house was and just come back around, and it was safer for people in general. So it was kind of like this cottage industry. And that was my first business, real business. And my business was, I was doing that from around 18 to around 22 years old.
And how'd you get into that?
Really hard hours.
What exposed you to that?
Seeing the van drivers drive down the block and going, hey man, why don't I just get my own damn van?
And I'm curious, how'd you get the money to get the van? Like, I always loved like the detail side of this.
I worked at Red Lobster. I also worked at various other places. I saved up money. See, I was always somebody who was trying to leverage whatever I had, right? So whether it was I built a bicycle so that I could ride it and eventually sell it, it was let me get a van. Because simultaneously, I wasn't selling FUBU yet, I was trying to sell clothing, but simultaneously I was like, okay, the van, I have a car. On my way to go someplace, I can make $20 picking up people back and forth, and then I could take the seats out of the van and put clothing in there and go to a flea market one day. So I was always trying to maximize whatever I had.
Yep, got it. And curious because it's fun to see like the disparity here in a lot of different entrepreneurs. Like, how was school for you? You know, it sounds like you were hustling at a young age and trying to make money and help your mom out and buy stuff for yourself. Were you an A student all through high school, or did you pay attention to one, or were you kind of the other end or somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, I was pretty bad. I was a C student. Well, first of all, I'm dyslexic, and I wouldn't know that until late 20s, early 30s. So I had a challenge in obviously history and in English, but I excelled in science and math. And I wouldn't say excel, but I was a B student. But even because I was so discouraged of, being yelled at from my father when he was around, and my mother loved me and she treated me with a lot of respect. But because I was discouraged of the reading part of it, even my excelling in math and everything else, if there was any part of it that you had to read, I would shun away from it. So I wasn't really good at school. But what did that do? Well, right around, I think the 10th grade or 11th grade, they had something called a co-op program in my school where you can go work at a company 1 week, and then you go to school every alternate week, and you got credits for it. So I ended up working as a messenger for a company called First Boston, which would end up being venture capitalists / angel investors, and I ended up working there. And I think that taught me a little bit about finance as well.
And did that like expose you to the idea, like when you started your first business, was that part of it? Like you're around this entrepreneurial kind of culture, or at least people that invest in, and you went,
No.
I could do one of these? Okay.
No, it wasn't the way that we think of investment traditionally today, like a lot of startups and I was a messenger, right? I wasn't open to a lot of the closed door conversations, but I did get to see people that look extremely wealthy, and were extremely wealthy. I was on 55th Street, I think it was 55th or 53rd in Manhattan, between Madison and Park, and over here was Rolex, over here was so forth, and I would see those private bankers or whatever, pulling up in Maseratis and Lamborghinis and going to these stores, and they all just worked in the building. And I was like, wow, there is money to be made doing this type of stuff. I'm not sure how to do it. Nobody in there looks like me, but there's money around here.
Yep. Got it. All right. So going back, so you sort of did the band thing from 18 to 22. What happened after that?
Well, my life kind of all happened at the same time, right? I really started FUBU in 1989, but I would close it 3 times from 89 to 92 because I ran out of capital. But that was, when I was 20, right? 89, I was 20 years old. So I'm working FUBU, I'm working Red Lobster, and I'm working the van at the same time. Yep. Right? So they all kind of blended together. And then I decided to stop the van around 2021. I was burnt out from it. I wasn't making a lot of money. I was making $300 a day, but by the time I paid for insurance, I had a beat up van. By the time I paid to get the thing fixed, and if only one Department of Transportation ticket, if they caught me, the Department of Transportation, in the bus zone picking people up, that was $2,000 in tickets. So I realized that I wasn't netting anything after paying for everything. And then I just quit that, went back to Red Lobster, and used the van to help me with FUBU.
Got it. And so what inspired you with FUBU? 20 years old, wanting to start fashion, like where did that come from?
Well, it came from a frustration that I was buying anything and everything that I could see in music videos. And I was told whether, I believe 90% of it was rumors now, that these fashion people disliked us. They did not want people of color, people who loved hip hop, rappers, inner city kids, whatever you want to call us at the time, right? It was not just the color. They didn't want us wearing their clothes. But this was a new emerging music that I loved. Hip hop was fairly new at that time. It was really only, from a commercial standpoint, it was probably only 4 years old. And I really was obsessed with it. So that was the frustration of saying, when can I, who's ever going to make clothes for the people that love, who they're making it for, and the music. So just like I saw the van drive by and I said, maybe I can do that. I saw Cross Colors and another guy named Carl Kanai making clothes, and I said, wow, I can do it too. So I'm not going to say that we were the first. We were not the first. We were inspired by 3 or 4 other really great companies.
And I love that because I see that kind of in common with a lot of successful people, that it's why not me is a big part of the mindset. Like, it's not that they're grandiose or they're hyper confident or even cocky about it. It's just it's more of the opposite, where they're just like, why can't I do that? They did it. Why can't I? Like it's a little bit more of like a lack of barriers and a lack of mental blocking than it is thinking that you're going to be grandiose. So you start going into it. Did you have a lot of contacts in sort of the hip hop space too? Did you have a lot of friends that had, made it at that point? Like what inspired that side?
Well, they weren't friends. I'm fortunate enough to say I had a lot of contacts, but most of those, the good thing is I grew up in Hollis, Queens. And Hollis, Queens has, if I would run off the names of the people in Hollis, Queens, you would say, what the hell's in the water?
Yeah.
At that time, it was Salt and Pepper, LL Cool J, Run DMC, some of the Fat Boys were from there, Tribe Called Quest, Onyx, so many other, at least another 15, I could say, Ja Rule, 50 Cent, a lot of them. So some of them were my friends, not the big artists, because LL Cool J and Run DMC were like massively huge, and they were one generation older than me, and that type of separation when you're in a neighborhood is pretty big, when it's like, oh, that was one of my brother's friends. But the ones I did grow up with, and my closest friends were me and a guy named Irv Gotti, who created something called Murder Inc., and another guy named Hype Williams, who became a very famous video director. And we would go on tours when we were about 16 years old, be on the Raising Hell tour, or some of these tours, the Fresh Fest tour, some of the first tours in the United States when it came to rap. And that's where I started to really get an understanding of that there was an escape from the hood that didn't have anything to do with drugs, and you can actually make money doing something you love. And but I couldn't rap, I could dance. I actually had auditioned for Houdini to be a dancer for a group named Houdini, and they said, okay. And my mother said, no, I'm not, you're 16 years old, you're not going around the world on a tour. So they ended up hiring a kid named Jermaine Dupri out of Atlanta for that tour.
Heard of him.
Yeah, so till today, I know Jermaine now, but I found out when I saw him in one of those videos, I was like, man, that could have been me.
It started pretty early. My father is a scientist, he's a physicist, and met my mother, who's not a scientist. She writes children's books under a different last name. They met in New York City when my father was a graduate student, came from Argentina, and on a naval scholarship, and was doing particle physics. And they met at a party in New York. They got married, moved to Palo Alto, California.
Was there like a great pickup line, like a really good scientific pickup line there?
I didn't ask him. I know they met at a party in New York City, and then they left out a number of details after that, leading to my sister and I. But so there's a kind of an ellipse there. But right, so they moved to Palo Alto, which was long before Silicon Valley. Bought a little home there for. If I told you what they paid for it, you would gasp, because there are two sides to Palo Alto, or two ends to it, and one is very expensive and the other is, at that time, was considered, actually it was very middle class area at that time. Now most of Palo Alto has transformed into very high cost living. But in any case, they moved there. My dad got a job in industry at Xerox PARC, which PARC, which was one of the original think tanks for development of some of the aspects of the personal computer, the so-called GUI interface, the GUI interface, moving pages on a screen. If you listen to Steve Jobs' a biography by Walter Isaacson, there's a description of a lot of what happened at PARC. It's an interesting place. Anyway, my dad was a computer scientist and physicist. So I grew up in a home where some of his graduate students would come over. He did have an affiliation with Stanford, although his primary appointment was at Xerox. And during summers, we would go to the Aspen Center for Physics, which is where some of the luminaries of the last century physics, like Murray Gell-Mann and Feynman and Peter Kaus and these other physics greats would assemble. And I was a little kid then, so running around, I was much more interested when I was a kid in birds and all things having to do with wildlife and predation. I was kind of obsessed with animal interactions. And
how old were you?
Love animals and biology. I was probably, so starting at about 5 or 6, I developed a real love of that. The story, the earliest, I think, mark that I might become a scientist was my dad used to walk me to school along our street, and then he would let me go on to the then kindergarten. I used to pick up a young lady on the way there and walk there, and he used to say, you have to go get her by yourself and then walk her the rest of the way. And he was trying to educate me in a number of things. In any case, one day he would take off down this path that would lead to Xerox PARC, and we were having a discussion. I asked him what he did, and he said he studied physics, and he was explaining to me, and I didn't get it. And he said, you know the feeling the night before your birthday? And I said, yes. He said, well, I feel that way every day when I go into my laboratory. I thought, wow, like that's really cool. So I said, I want to do what you do. And he said, well, I don't think you want to do that because I think most of the great mysteries of physics are going to be solved. I said, well, then what should I do? And he said, well, the brain's pretty interesting. We don't really understand anything about how the brain works. I said, well, I'll work on that. I'll figure out how the brain works.
And how old are you at this point?
So we both recall that conversation, and I was 6 years old at that point.
You were 6, wow.
I was 6, but I had no idea what I was talking about.
Right.
I was attached to this emotional thing about the birthday every day. Sounded great to me. So if he had told me that, he built rockets, I would have said, I want to build rockets, right?
Yeah.
That was kind of an early seed. Now, I was an okay student growing up until about age 13, 14. And then unfortunately, there was a very high conflict divorce in my home. home. Dad moved away. There was a lot of turmoil. So throughout high school, it was a very turbulent time. I didn't go to school very much. I was truant a lot. I was getting into a lot of trouble. I was actually removed from school, allowed back into school, put into another school, moved out of that school. In any case, to make a long story short, it was because of a high school girlfriend who was a year older than I was that went off to UC Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be near her. So what happened was my senior year of high school, I was driving down there all the time, living in my car in the parking lot outside her dorm. She was pretty terrific and I wasn't about to let her get away. And then at that time I thought I would go into the fire service. I've always been very physical. I've always had a lot of physical energy, and I discovered running and weightlifting, and I wanted to join the fire service. So I was very interested in, like, if you look at my high school senior yearbook, the photo at the end is me, I think, on a motorcycle or something. It says like future fire, like my parents put that photo there and it says like, we love you, future firemen, or something like that. So it has no, complete deviation.
Which I love because, like, again, you got 6 years old, you had this like seed planted, but even 18 graduating high school, and again, you've built to this point a career in it. You still had no idea, like you're going to be a very different path.
No concept. And I had tried a number of things. So during high school, I was very heavily into skateboarding. I fell really deep into the skateboarding community, and I wasn't very good at it. A lot of people I knew got very good at it, went on to create careers, either as skateboarders or skateboard company founders and owners, clothing companies. A lot of them also, unfortunately, didn't do well in life, dead, jail, mental illness issues, but there were some that did very well. I realized pretty quickly that I wasn't going to succeed as an athlete. I was getting hurt a lot. That's actually what inspired me to start working out and to start strengthening my body and learning more about my body, which is still something that I care very much about for reasons that I'll get into in a moment because it weaves back into science. But in any case, there was no indication. I thought I'd become a fireman. That seemed good. I really wasn't good at anything else. And I don't know if I would have made a good firefighter or not, but I loved the camaraderie. I was then staying at the engine house from time to time and really enjoyed the work and the people. I thought community service and people generally like firemen, firefighters, firemen and women. People tend to like them because they're not often in conflict with the general public. They're often almost always there to serve the general public, always.
Yeah.
So in any case,
we've had that discussion with a lot of the, what's going on with the police right now. And it's like, well, it's not that often. You're dealing with police more often because you don't want to than you do versus firemen. You never don't want to see them kind of thing. If they're there, they're helping someone.
Absolutely. And in a very non-political way, I learned at that time, I developed this real interest and sensitivity through skateboarding to people that grew up with a lot less opportunity than you do growing up as a kid in Palo Alto. I think it sensitized me to that, which I'm grateful for that exposure. It sensitized me to the tremendous value for first responders, including police officers and firefighters. And that was a really powerful and eye-opening set of experiences. Eventually what happened was I wanted to be near my girlfriend. Yeah. And so I took the SAT and I don't know how I didn't score extremely well. I went to a very competitive high school, went to Gunn High School, Gunn is the way it's spelled. It's one of the top high schools in the country. It's a public high school. And every kid I knew was like Harvard early admissions, Cornell early, all this stuff. It's in the town of Stanford. And here I was, but I got in, I did okay on the SAT and not great. And I wrote my college entrance essay basically about the fact that I'd had this very stable upbringing until about 13, 14. And then it just really been chaos. And I'd been wandering and batted around, and I don't want to make it seem worse than it was, but I didn't have any direction. And I conveyed that, except that I said, look, I think I found a direction, which is like to go into the fire department. I see myself in some role of public service, and having a bachelor's degree would help me develop some leadership skills, expand my knowledge, et cetera. I did not say I also really want to be close to my girlfriend who's already in college, but what ended up happening was I got in and I went. And after the first year, because I wasn't organized around my academics, I did very poorly, and I ended up leaving. I left on a leave of absence. I actually got into some trouble while I was there. Nothing too severe, but nothing great either. Nothing I'm proud of. And what ended up happening was I moved home and I went to community college for 2 semesters. And at that point, I really locked it down. I really decided this is it. This is my opportunity to turn my life around. I'm 19 years old. I'm not going anywhere. A lot of my friends that were still back home, were getting into a lot of trouble with drugs and violence. And I just made the decision. And so I moved back to school. I put myself in a studio apartment, meaning I wasn't gonna be surrounded by roommates or any kind of excitement. And basically for 4 years, all I really did was study, lift weights, and run. And it was just a very structured living. It was lonely at times. The girlfriend and I had split up. She eventually graduated and moved away. But I had a professor who turned me on to neuroscience. His name was Harry Carlisle, and he was a phenomenal
What did you go
professor.
to school for? What was your bachelor's degree supposed to be in?
So I went in undeclared, but I went and worked for this guy, worked in his lab. He took a liking to me and I took a liking to him. And I had a strong work ethic. I've always been, I think that energy when you start channeling it, I wasn't perfect at channeling it at the beginning, but I could work. I could really put in the hours and started working in his lab. I eventually graduated. I did a senior thesis in his lab, et cetera, was doing experiments in a degree in psychology with a biological emphasis. Back then, there was actually no neuroscience degree at any university. A few on the East Coast eventually had them, but this was back in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. And so about a year before I graduated, he pulled me aside and said, you might want to consider going to graduate school. And I knew a little bit about what graduate school entailed because of my dad and my early upbringing. And so I applied and I got in a couple places and I ended up going to Berkeley. Mm-hmm. I did a master's in what back then was called behavioral neuroscience, but nowadays we would have called it neuroscience, behavior, and endocrinology. I was studying how light and some of the pathways involved with light regulate this hormone melatonin, which is involved in sleepiness. And I was looking at neuroanatomical pathways in the brain and that kind of thing. So I did a master's at Berkeley. It was supposed to be a PhD, but about halfway through, I took a course from a woman named Carla Schatz, who in the world of neurobiology is very famous. She was the one, not Donald Hebb, who coined the phrase fire together, wire together. Mm-hmm. Carla is a phenomenal neurobiologist who discovered that behaviors early in life, as well as electrical activity of neurons while we're still in utero, still in our mom's womb, shapes the way the brain develops. And I took a course from her and was just so excited about this stuff. So I went to her and said, I want to work with you. I want to do my PhD with you. And she said, well, I'm moving to Harvard and you don't really have a lot of background in cellular and molecular neuroscience. So I think you should go work for somebody who's starting their own lab. And she said, there's a woman up at Davis named Barbara Chapman, who's starting her lab. You should go up there. And I thought, I love Berkeley. I was at UC Berkeley. Like, why would I go to UC Davis? To me, Davis was a place that we stop on the way to Tahoe when we're going snowboarding.
Exactly.
But I drove up there and I drove into the little town of Davis and I met with this woman, Barbara Chapman. And, every once in a while, just like meeting Harry Carlisle or getting to know Carla, there are these moments of kind of intellectual or professional chemistry that you have with somebody. You're not aware if they have them with you. I don't know what they thought about me at the time, but I thought I have to work for this woman. So took my master's from Berkeley, went up to Davis. And I remember at that time, my dad and I had reconciled and I told him, I said, I'm leaving Berkeley and I'm going to go to Davis to get my PhD. And look, Davis is a great school. Don't get me wrong. But Berkeley's considered an A-tier school, and Davis. There's great research going on at many universities. But he said, "Well, tell me more about this program." And I said, "Well, there are only 2 of us in the incoming class." And he said, "Well, either this is the best decision you're ever going to make, or the biggest mistake you're going to make in your academic career." And I still remember that. So what happened was, I got to Davis. I loved working in Barbara Chapman's lab. We were studying brain development, how the visual system develops, neuroplasticity, things of that sort. I adored Barbara because she was this really tough lady, great scientist, very rigorous, long, hard experiments. And I was just on fire at that point, having my dad tell me, look, you're either making the biggest mistake of your life or the best decision of your professional life. I was kind of an animal. I mean, I was a 25-year-old guy. So I actually was the only student in Barbara's lab. And I put tinfoil on the windows and I would lock the doors and I would just play music all day and just do experiments all day long. She had her office across the street. I remember thinking, like, I'm going to give this everything. I'm not kidding. I actually slept and lived in the office down the hall from the lab, brushed my teeth there in the morning, would go right back in. And I was in paradise. For me at that age, there are these few times in life when you have the opportunity to be very pure relationship to your professional or academic life. I had no relationship at that time besides I had friends, I dated a little bit, but I was just all in. And
So I'm curious,
it was still the most productive period of my life.
Start from the top, Belarus.
Belarus, 1975, November 14th, 20 inches of snow, according to the legend. And, just very humble beginnings. 1975 to 1978, Belarus to 20-year-old parents is like 1930s America for people that are listening. And so, very humble beginnings. Like, we didn't have Pampers in Russia. Like, it's hard for Americans to understand where Russia was. It was more third world country, even though it was the Cold War. So, for example, I grew up without having Pampers, and I was a big peer. So, like, literally, like, in these stockings, my mom would have to like change me 6 times a day. Like, we'd go out to the park to get some fresh air, and she was 5 steps out and I'd pee my pants. We have to go back in, like, just real fun kind of like 1920s like stories. Come to America.
Do you have memories of that? Do you actually like?
No, I don't remember a single thing of Russia. We also spent HIAS, big shout out to HIAS, is an organization that helped me and my family and other Russian Jews get out of the country in the late 70s, a couple 100,000. So I'm very lucky. When you think about the math, the way we got to America was through Austria and Italy, and then you came to America. So Austria and Italy were kind of these hubs for a lot of the people that know this story or maybe even live this story. So we were a couple weeks in Austria, and we were in Italy for several months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I don't remember Austria or Italy, but I start remembering my life within weeks of being in America. Now, probably because unfortunately, one of the first things I remember is grabbing tea off the table in Queens, burning my leg and going to the hospital for 3 days.
Oh, wow.
So that happened.
How old were you? How old were you when you came over?
I was 3.5 when I came over. That happened right after I turned 4.
Okay.
So, family, grandmother, we lived with my great-grandparents, we lived with my aunt and uncle. The first year was real rugged. My dad had a very well-off, wealthy great uncle, his grandmother's brother, that was going to kind of like help us. But while we were in Italy, he dies. Yeah. So now we roll in, and big credit to Arlene Newman and Bob Siegelman. That great-grandfather or great-uncle of my dad, Jack Siegelman's children, they very much did do the right thing by us. They helped my dad buy a car. They got my dad a job as a construction worker in their construction company. And then ultimately, they got a job for my dad as a stock boy in the liquor store that the family owned.
Got it.
That liquor store was a small store in the late 70s, early 80s.
Where was it?
It was in Clark, New Jersey. And my dad starts working there, $2, $3, $4 an hour, very humble beginnings, commuting from Queens to New Jersey, rugged life. But something interesting happened. Many of the individuals that worked in that store decided to pack up and move to San Francisco at the same time.
Was there a reason and driving thing behind it?
Yeah. I asked my dad years later, I think the majority of the men that worked there were gay men, and they went to San Francisco in 1980. Yeah. Go and hang. Yeah. So my dad gets kind of promoted with no English to be the manager of the store. What ends up happening is New Jersey changes liquor laws. There was something called regulation, which meant every liquor store in New Jersey had to mark up every product 35% minimum as a baseline markup. Liquor stores were good businesses. There was no competition. Like, if you just wanted to make 35% markup, you could build your lot, and you could obviously make more. Well, they deregulated, and now you could sell at any price. My dad and his entrepreneurial capabilities teams up with some other guys he met early on in the industry, and they start a co-op called Shoppers Discount Liquors, and they start selling liquor and beer, mainly, not wine, at very low costs, including dead cost. They all chip in money and start running ads in the newspaper.
So where did that come from? Like, where did your dad get his entrepreneurial spirit? Obviously, he took a risk leaving everything and coming to the US, but
DNA game, right? My dad's dad, my dad's grandmother, my dad's mother were very entrepreneurial by the legends and stories I've heard, kind of like selling roosters at the market shit, like real stuff like that. Yeah. Right? And so
entrepreneurship. Yeah.
I mean, the same way I got it from, it's in us. And so he had great intuition. He worked, his work ethic was, and my mom's for that matter, bar none. That's where I get it from. And away we go. Ronald Reagan era, economy turns. And we are now living in a townhouse in the early 1980s. And we are now in middle-class territory, and we grew up.
Were you still in Queens, or where were you?
At that point, we moved to Dover, New Jersey, and then we moved to Edison, New Jersey. And Edison, New Jersey is where I grew up from 1982 to 1990. And that's kind of where I'm become me, outside Jersey kid, meaning go outside all day. Sports.
What was your sports? What did you like to play?
Everything, but a heavy baseball, heavy baseball, football, a little bit of basketball, little street hockey, a lot of games, laser tag, wrestling each other. running in the woods, war, water guns, just real Americana 80s
getting
kid.
out. Yeah.
Now can speak the language, fall in love with American football. That's where the Jet stuff comes.
And yeah, that's on that note. I know when you first moved here, you didn't speak the language. How long did that take you? How was that transition?
That's the beauty. If anybody who knows or has been around this, if you're under 6, it's like cake. It's cake. You're immersed. I watched the Flintstones and Scooby-Doo, and
got it.
Once I went to school, game over. So that wasn't the hardest part. I do recall being picked on quite a bit in Dover, New Jersey, for not being able to speak English. So that was maybe the only rough patch of that. And then, that in hindsight, this is stuff when I started realizing a little bit more about myself in my 30s. In hindsight, I spent a staggering amount of time doing business. It snowed. You could count on me at least doing half the day shoveling snow. Like it was very rare for me to have a snow day that looked like sledding and snowman and snowball fight the whole day. Of course I did some, but like my energy, my DNA took me to shoveling.
And so that would be is that your first like entrepreneurial endeavor? Because I know we all have that like little kid story. Was it shoveling snow or what was it really?
I don't want to bullshit you. I'll give you a bunch.
Yeah, please.
Between lemonade, snow shoveling, the one I'm least proud of, picking flowers in people's yards and then ringing their own doorbells back to sell back the flowers to them.
I did the exact same thing. I'd steal my mom's own flowers too and sell them to the neighbors.
It's amazing. All my friends' favorite one, given my Jewish roots, the Christmas Carol business I started, we would literally ring doorbells and literally be like, "Hey ma'am, would you like Christmas carols?" And like in the 2 seconds that I could see her pause, I'd be like, "Hit it, boys!" Dashing through this, just like.
It's, by the way, a young Jewish kid singing Christmas carols. I like it.
It's really big shout out to Robbie Turnick. He actually, the reason a lot of people who really, really follow me never hear that story is I only was reminded of that by Robbie Turnick in the last 18 months. So big shout out for him reminding me of that hustle. A big one was washing cars. That was a big one. Carrying the hose, like.
And how old were you when you started all this? Like, when did it kick off? Were you 8, 7?
7, 8, 9, 10, heavy. And then
did something drive you? Like, was there something you wanted the money for, or was it just you loved the chase?
I love the chase. Yeah. Like, I don't even recall, like, I don't have that great story of like, and I bought my bike or I know I bought Nintendo, but I don't remember it being about buying Nintendo. It's who I am now. I mean, you've got, obviously with your friendship with Jeff Nicholson and being similar to space, and we've had the luxury of interacting. And I'm sure, back to your earlier point, when you're out there, people talk and you get to hear the stories from people that actually know you versus the people that are listening now that have opinions of me but don't know me. And I understand both pro and con opinions if you don't know me because of my energy, personality type, conviction, ambition, style, jersey. I get it all. But I think not that we know each other the most, but we know each other enough that really about the game. Like I'm just not that guy. I'm not looking for the Bentley. I'm not looking for the yacht. Yes, I am trying to buy the New York Jets, but even that is almost like I've come to realize, that's the game too. That's not a
monetary, that's not a bragging rights. It's a passion. And I get that. The reason the money's a means to do it, but still.
What's funny? As you were just talking, I was like thinking how I'm feeling right now. I really, really, really want to win a Super Bowl.
Yeah.
And like in my brain, especially right now, because everyone's really on tilt in Jets Nation. Yeah. I mean, it's, I'm at the point where I feel like I have to do it myself. And so fuck it. And listen, I'd be lying if I didn't say there's absolutely part of me that understands that it would be such a remarkable, fun American story of boy comes to America. A famous story I do tell is when we couldn't afford buying me a Jets jersey when all my friends had one, my mom knitted me one. It is my prized possession. Yep. And I think that, I think a lot about that shit. And so I do have a little bit of romance around that narrative and think it'd be pretty cool. Yeah, that's who I was. And obviously it's fun to tell this part of the story because it's in the news more now and part of our culture more now. And then 1985 happened and sports cards explosion started and it was perfect timing. I love sports. I love business. I'm 10 years old and away we go. And I basically from 86 to 93 to 92, 93.
You're like 11 to 18 kind of thing.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, like basically from a 10 to 17, 16 and a half, 17, 16 and a half. That's funny. Like 10 to 17, I would tell you that 80% of my energy and mentality was around sports cards, buying them, selling them, being in them. I was an atrocious student. I was obsessed. Mm-hmm. And basically I would argue that what makes me who I am today as a businessman was really honed in from 10 to 20 at card shows and in my dad's liquor store. I would stand behind a table at a card show in a mall and basically spend 10 hours a day watching people. Even then, Erik, this is what I do for a living now. I would watch people and I would make adjustments to my table. I would make adjustments to where I would ask my table to be. I would, I learned by watching people.
I think it was actually in that order. I told some jokes. Everybody started laughing. And I said, you know what, guys, let me throw something on the grill.
Perfect.
And as a baby, that was it. I was just known to throw celebrations from there on out.
Dream of
They used to call me Said the Celebration before the Entertainer.
Perfect. And Anthony, how about you? You start getting everyone laughing in the delivery room. How did it start?
It started in preschool. The principal of the school kept calling my house, asking my parents if they stop bringing me to barbecues at such an early age because the smoke would probably kill me. Not knowing that as a small toddler, I was in the backyard smoking the meats myself. So that's all began for me.
Perfect. Yeah, Cedric, starting from the beginning, where are you from? Where did it all start?
I grew up in the small town of Caruthersville, Missouri, it's the Boot Hill of Missouri, right at the Arkansas border, Tennessee border. And, family, full family, grandmothers, cousins on all the sides. And then eventually moved to St. Louis when I was about 10 years old. And so grew up mainly high school years, everything from St. Louis. So I represent both places in a real way. I call Caruthersville my home and I call St. Louis my home, because those true formative years, those high school years is when I lived in the city of St. Louis.
On that note, what did your parents do? Growing up, how was childhood? What you were exposed to as a kid?
Yeah, my mother was a school teacher for over 30 years, a reading specialist. Went on to get her master's and eventually higher education. And my father worked for AT&T for many years, but they were separated. I mainly grew up in a single parent household with my younger sister. So, that was my exposure. Of course, a lot of family around there, uncles, cousins, but my mother was a person who kind of dreamed big and, always wanted to get out of that small town she was in. So she kind of manifested that as in us. We traveled quite a bit as kids, getting in the car, going places, flew on airplanes pretty early in my life because my mother was one of those people that aspired to see life, mainly from her reading, that she would love to read about places and we're going there. I'm showing my kids this,
Awesome. And so as a young kid, what did you want to do? There's always, I want to be this when I grow up. Was it a barbecue guy? Was it a comedian? Or was there some other stuff going on?
Definitely early on, I was influenced by the TV show Fame, man. And so I was one of those kids that, early in my life recognized that I could sing, I could dance. Didn't really knew I was witty, but didn't know comedy was a real kind of way to, have a career or a real career. But we knew singers and we saw dancers, from the Solid Golds and the Soul Trains of it all. So, as I got to high school, I actually wanted to be a lawyer because I was a pretty, decent. I loved social issues and I loved to, kind of have a good debate with people, a good argument. So I went to school on pre-law and my counselor heard my voice and then met my personality as I was in college and kind of guided me more into media and arts. So I ended up getting my degree in, mass media and broadcasting. Got
it. And so when you made that transition, what kind of media were you going to get into? Was it you still just liked overall performance, or were you when did it?
It was pretty early. It was pretty early. I definitely studied. I minored in theater, but this was early on in the days of the entertainment news started to happen. So shows like Entertainment Tonight and Access Hollywood were in their infancy. And so the guys that did fun news stories, more, so it was that world. And so I was being guided into that because it fit my personality more. So, I think I could have gave Kevin Frazier a run for his money. I still want your job, Kevin Frazier.
Coming for him. Anthony, how are we doing? Same kind of question, from the beginning, tell me about where did it all start? What did you want to be when you grew up when you were 5?
It was interesting. I've never heard that story from you said about you wanting to be a lawyer because that's what I wanted to be as a kid.
Really?
I wanted to play football for the Dallas Cowboys. That was my dad's team.
Yep.
I wanted to be a lawyer. and eventually become a judge. And I also wanted to be an actor. And at the age of 9, I realized that if I became an actor, I could become all 3 of those things and whatever else I wanted to become in life. And so that's what I dedicated my childhood and my life to, age 9, pursuing this dream as an actor. You know, putting myself not at the beck and call of my mom wanting me to do something, but I found little acting conservatories to go to on the weekend. And anytime I had a chance to have a captive audience in church, be it a spelling bee in school, anytime the teacher asked me to read aloud, I was always the first to raise my hand because I knew that I had a captive audience and I could do whatever I wanted to do in front of them. So it started at a very early age for me.
And so when did you hit a point, like you obviously started really young, when did you hit a point that's like, I did this, like I'm actually an actor now? Like at what stage was it that you felt like you had actually succeeded, I guess is the question.
It succeeded probably when I was accepted into the high school for the performing arts. And realizing that, you know, an institution or a group of people recognized the talent that I had. And then, you know, performing in school. Yep. You know, I went to school with Tammy Townsend's, Jenna Elfman's, and a bunch of other people. And then eventually the Wendy Raquel Robinsons and the Paula Parkers and the Carr Anthony Paynes and working alongside them earlier on, even before my professional career started. That's when I knew that I was like, oh, okay, I can do this.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. And so, Cedric, same question. At what point did you feel like, oh, wow, I've become successful. Like this worked. I went for it. I wanted to get into media. I wanted to get into acting. And now this is working. I can actually do this.
You know, I think for me, it probably had to be in the late 90s. I competed in a comedy competition that was kind of big regionally. I had to travel to Chicago to be a part of it. So that took me out of St. Louis, out of my regular kind of group of people. And I competed against, a more bigger group of folks, and won. And I won $3,000 and they gave you the big fake check. And you also got featured in Jet magazine. And so anybody knows in the hood, if you in Jet magazine, that's top of the food chain, man. So it's a small magazine, but it's the biggest thing you could be in. And so they had a picture of me in Jet, and I had that $3,000 check. And man, you couldn't tell me I wasn't the richest dude in town. And that was it. That was that thing where you realize, you believe in yourself enough to always kind of continue to fight for the dream once you accomplish something, beyond that comfort zone of your own kind of hometown.
As you were younger, did you dream that you'd get to this level? Like, were you confident that like, oh, I'm going to be huge in this? Like, I'm made for this. I used to love watching Jackie Gleason with my grandmother. And that was one of the kind of things that motivated me because he was an unconventional star. He was a bigger guy. But he was always very, debonair and cool and smooth on his feet. And he did a show that, included others. And so it was something I always envisioned myself doing, like having like that kind of variety show, which I did for a period with my show, Cedric the Entertainer Presents. But, I think that was something that I did start to internalize as a young man and believe that, yes, one day I would reach the goals that I wanted, of course, not knowing how it was going to happen, but I definitely had that hope and saw myself being at the top of the food chain somehow. And on that note, through the success you've had, what was the surprising challenges? Like what came up that you're like you never would have anticipated this was the hard part, or like what was different than you expected through the process?
For the most part is self-doubt. Once you get some success and you start to believe that success, but if you hit any kind of slowdown period, you hit anything that kind of somebody denies you when everything's been going well and someone goes like, no, you're not our guy, then self-doubt kicks in. And it's an interesting thing when you're having success and then someone gives you a reason to call for pause. And that pause is sometimes more devastating than not believing at all. Yep. So, I think that it was those moments in a career where you have to continue to fight, continue to believe, continue to trust that the things that you've done to get you there will continue to lift you up long as you have that great work ethic and belief in yourself. But those are those real hard moments when you run up against self-doubt, man.
And it's amazing how that's true to like any career, any industry, like that'll happen. And so it's amazing how that ties through. Anthony, same kind of thing. Like, when you got into acting at 9, did you go, or were you like in your head, you're like, I'm going to be huge. Everyone's going to know my name, my face. Like, I'm going to have my own shows. Like, I'm going to be out there. Did you have that in your head the whole time? Were you hyper confident getting into it, or how did you think about it?
No, I had to believe and dream this big in order for it to happen. Because if you don't see it, then you don't believe it. If you don't believe it, you don't see it. So I always had dreams of grandeur, being at the top of the food chain in my craft.